Hello everyone. I hope you're having a nice day. So, in our previous lecture, we had talked about the arrival of Mahatma Gandhi and the three Gandhian Satyagrahas, three early Satyagrahas. Now, we are going to move to a new block in our theme of the national movement, and that is going to be the rise of post-war discontent. ठीक है? Now, the Khilafat non-cooperation movement was the first true mass movement at an all India level organized by Mahatma Gandhi. However, the energy needed for that movement did not arise spontaneously. It built up consistently throughout the year of 1919 due to a number of perceived betrayals by the Indian nationalists by the British government. हुआ क्या था that during the First World War, the Indian people and the Indian nationalists had given their full-fledged support to the British war effort, and in return, they had been assured of liberal reforms. They had been assured that some kind of self-governance is going to be granted to Indians, that major constitutional reforms are going to be introduced in order to fulfill the most critical and most crucial nationalist demands. However, the trust that the Indian nationalists had invested in the British was betrayed through a series of wrongs. These are known collectively as the 1919 wrongs. First of all was the Rowlatt Act. Secondly, there was the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. And the report submitted by the Inquiry Commission instituted to investigate this massacre, that is the Hunter Commission or the Disorders Inquiry Commission, and its report. Thirdly, Indian trust in the British government was further given a jolt with the new constitutional mechanism introduced by the Montford Reforms or the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms or the Government of India Act 1919. And lastly, the issue around which anti-colonial sentiment across India was galvanized by Mahatma Gandhi, bringing Hindus and Muslims onto a common platform of action, was the Khilafat issue. Okay? So, these were the 1919 wrongs. And why the bite of these wrongs stung so deeply in the Indian consciousness was because India was already suffering. Indians had been made to tolerate 4 years of high inflation, shortage of critical materials, famines, outsourcing of the British military budget onto the Indian taxpayer, offloading of the British military budget onto the Indian taxpayer. Further, a number of Indians, young Indians, had been conscripted into the British Indian Army and sent off to fight foreign wars. Many of them never returned. Many of them returned traumatized by their experience in the first truly industrialized war, that is the First World War. And many of them returned without limbs, with missing eyes, with missing arms, with missing ears, right? So there was a lot of anger against the British already, and people expected quick relief from the British. While the British had indicated some moves towards this, for example, through the August Declaration of 1917 or the policy of general amnesty that had been introduced towards all political prisoners who had been imprisoned during the war. So they were all released. But this trust was quickly betrayed through these 1919 wrongs, right? So before we discuss each of these one by one, एक छोटा सा प्रीफेस ले लो पोस्ट वॉर डिस्कंटेंट का बैकग्राउंड. You can write down. Following the end of the First World War, India witnessed a strong wave of rising post-war discontent with British rule. Full stop. Indians had wholeheartedly supported the British war effort quietly accepting or quietly suffering wartime hardships. Full stop. They had been promised rich rewards for their loyalty. Full stop. However, the trust reposed by Indians in the British guarantees and promises was shattered by the 1919 wrongs. क्या है 1919 wrongs in the form of sub points? You can write the Rowlatt Act Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, the Montford Reforms, and the Khilafat wrongs. Full stop. Next main point. Indians felt betrayed by these wrongs and vented their discontent by reviving mass nationalist activity which ramped up throughout 1919 to finally culminate in the Khilafat non-cooperation movement. In the Khilafat non-cooperation movement. ठीक है, तो ये तो हो गया the preface to the anti-British activity in the year following the end of the war. Now we are going to look at these developments one by one. First of all, can you give the heading? Rowlatt Act and the Gandhian Satyagraha against it. So Rowlatt Act and Satyagraha. Now, what was the Rowlatt Act? On the basis of the recommendations of the Rowlatt Committee, its official name was the Sedition Committee. The British government of India passed the Rowlatt Act. तो जो सेडिशन कमिटी था, it was headed by a British official called C.P. Rowlatt. So it had drafted the bill, and the resulting act was therefore also called the Rowlatt Act. Its official name was the Indian Sedition Prevention Act, right? So the British government passed the Rowlatt Act. Full stop. This act came as a huge shock. Acha, this was passed in March 1919. Okay, this act came as a huge shock to the Indian nationalists since it represented a major violation of Indian civil liberties. तो किया क्या था इस एक्ट में? क्या कंट्रोवर्शियल प्रोविजंस थे? राइट डाउन. it made the wartime restrictions on Indian freedoms permanent. Now, wartime में some of the civil rights of citizens or subjects are generally suspended because the nation is at war, because the government is at war, and preserving the government, preserving the state becomes the priority. So, in such a scenario, although it is still not constitutional, but most jurists or constitutionalists agree that in emergency situations, the needs of the collective must be put above the needs of the individual. The needs of the state must be put above the needs of the society. तो कुछ वॉर टाइम रिस्ट्रिक्शंस को लोग फिर भी एक्सेप्ट कर लेते हैं. For example, the writ of habeas corpus can become suspended as a result of wartime, you can say, restrictions, or the burden of proof may be diluted on the prosecution in order to ascertain guilt of an accused. So it would provide for those who can prospectively threaten the security of the state to be imprisoned without trial or without due course, right? तो इस तरह की चीजें जो थी, they had been introduced in the Indian legal system under a wartime regulation, the Defense of India rules or Defense of India regulations. आगे लिखो. The Defense of India Act 1915 had provided for the preventive detention of Indians on the basis of the suspicion of sedition. ठीक है. So the prosecution or the British, you can say, sarkari vakils would not have to prove that certain Indians were actually conspiring to overthrow the government during this extremely critical period of the First World War. Merely on the basis of the suspicion of sedition, that is, activities to overthrow the government, they could be put behind bars. इसको बोलते हैं प्रिवेंटिव डिटेंशन. अब ड्यूरिंग वॉर तो फिर भी समझ में आता है, बट व्हाट द Rowlatt Act was seeking to do na, that it was making this preventive detention rule permanent and applying it even during the normal peacetime situations. And the experience of Indians with this preventive detention had been quite a bitter one. क्यों? During the war, the preventive detention provisions of the Defense of India Act had been used widely to suppress not only revolutionary but also peaceful and mainstream nationalist activity. ठीक है? So even Khilafatists or Home Rule Leaguers had been preventively detained under the provisions of the Defence of India regulation. And the British had actively been using these provisions in order to suppress all kinds of anti-British politics. Okay? So this was a very draconian measure. But given the context of the war, Indians still made peace with it, or at least, if not peace with it, at least they came to an understanding with the British. Right? Now, the Rowlatt Act made this provision permanent and applicable during peacetime. Okay? So now the British are going to have one more stick with which to beat down Indian politics and Indian nationalism. The Defence of India rules had proven very effective in suppressing nationalist activity during the war, and the British found themselves on shaky ground following the end of the war. They had suffered huge economic losses, and they realized the need to shift the burden of the British economic losses onto the Indian economy. Okay? However, that would have invited a great degree of popular resistance, especially organized popular resistance. So the British were preparing to crack down on this resistance through this legal apparatus, the Rowlatt Act. ठीक है? क्या बोला इसने? It provided that any Indian could be held without trial for a period of 2 years on suspicion of seditious activity or conspiracy against the government. Now, what are the problematic aspects of this provision? First of all, it is discriminatory. It targeted only Indians. So, it provided that any Indian. Okay? Secondly, it suspended the writ of habeas corpus and fair hearing. It provided that any Indian could be held without trial, without being produced before a judge or a magistrate for a period of 2 years. So the government would not even have to make the case that this person needs to be behind bars. And lastly, merely on the suspicion of seditious activity. So it would not have to give any evidence. So this was a huge violation of the principles of natural justice. And you can, as expected, the response from the Indian intelligentsia and the political class was a very, you can say, a radical one. They were shocked by this. They were not expecting this at all. Okay? Now, response में हुआ क्या? The Rowlatt Satyagraha. Indian leaders of all political hues condemned the Rowlatt Act, and some leading members of the Imperial Legislative Council resigned in protest, and some Indian members resigned from the Imperial Legislative Council. कौन कौन है ये? मदन मोहन मालवीय, मजहरुल हक एंड मोहम्मद अली जिन्ना. ठीक है. However, the mere act of resignation from the Indian Legislative Council was not enough. Mahatma Gandhi recognized the revolutionary nature of the situation. बताया था ना, people were already fed up because of long periods of wartime suffering, privation, shortages, inflation, conscription, loss of life, etc. So Mahatma Gandhi, he truly emerged as the true leader of the mass movement because he resonated with the feelings of the ordinary Indian. He recognized that there was a lot of latent anger, and if directed in an organized manner, it could do great harm to the British government, and it could bring great benefit to the nationalist cause. Mahatma Gandhi recognized the revolutionary nature of the situation and organized the Rowlatt Satyagraha. ठीक है. Now, at this point of time, the Congress, despite the efforts of leaders such as Tilak and Annie Besant, had not been able to revive itself completely. So there was lack of organization, and because Annie Besant and Tilak had both used their own separate home rule leagues rather than the Congress in order to cultivate a grassroots network of nationalists, therefore Congress was not organizationally prepared to launch any mass movement at this point of time. So महात्मा गांधी भी कांग्रेस को यूज नहीं करेंगे. क्या किया इन्होंने? He set up the Satyagraha Sabha to organize the Rowlatt Satyagraha. Because the Congress lacked the organizational capability to do so. एंड महात्मा गांधी के लिए इस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को एस्टैब्लिश करना थोड़ा आसान इसलिए हो गया बिकॉज ही कुड नाउ एनरोप those nationalists who had already been activated during the home rule movement, that is the volunteers of the Home Rule Leagues of Tilak and Annie Besant. Further, during the Home Rule movement, गोपाल कृष्ण गोखले का जो सोशल सर्विस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन था, द सर्वेंट्स ऑफ इंडिया सोसाइटी, दे हैड आल्सो स्टार्टेड द प्रैक्टिस of providing national service not through political activism but by providing relief. However, there was a lot of latent political consciousness among the cadres of the servants of India society as well. So they could also be transformed into a political, you can say, entity. तो महात्मा गांधी ने इन तीनों ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के वॉलंटियर्स को अपनी सत्याग्रह सभा में एनरोल कर लिया. महात्मा गांधी efficiently enrobed the volunteers of Bal Gangadhar Tilak's and Annie Besant's Home Rule Leagues and Gopal Krishna Gokhale's Servants of India Society. ठीक है? And this allowed him to launch his program of an all India strike in a very effective manner. आगे लिखो. He gave the call for an all India strike on April the 6th, 1919. ठीक है? Now, जो ऑल इंडिया स्ट्राइक या भारत बंद का कॉल है, in order to educate the people on why this was important, do you think simply giving a political message would be sufficient? कि by preventive detention क्या है, why it is wrong, etc. Would it be very easy to convey this to the ordinary Indian? नहीं. प्रिवेंटिव डिटेंशन आप भी आज सड़क चलते इंसान को पूछोगे कि क्या है, why it is wrong, they would probably not be able to give you a satisfactory answer. This problem was even more, you can say, acute back then. However, in order to mobilize support for this program, Mahatma Gandhi organized massive सर्वधर्म प्रार्थना सभाs across India. ठीक है? And सर्वधर्म प्रार्थना सभाs were meant not only to mobilize Indians on a large scale, but Mahatma Gandhi had transformed what used to be a very private activity, that is prayer, into a political activity, right? So this brought the masses out on the streets into these meetings, and it also provided the basis for all India unity, especially that between Hindus and Muslims, because not only was he able to enrope the support of the servants of India society and home rule leaguers, but also the Khilafatists or the pan-Islamists who were angry at the British because they, or who were dissatisfied with the British because the British government had failed to promise that they are not going to mistreat the Khalifa following their victory against the Ottoman Empire during the फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर, तो खिलाफत इशू से रिलेटेड था, तो उनका सपोर्ट भी इन्होंने एनलिस्ट कर लिया था। एंड सर्वधर्म प्रार्थना सभाs were used in order to mobilize Hindus and Muslims onto a common religious and political platform. एंड साथ में not only did he give the call for an all India strike on the 6th of April, he also organized several other movements. So the action plan for the Rowlatt Satyagraha not only involved an all India strike and Sarvdham Pratna Sabhas, but also civil disobedience and courting arrest. Fasting and prayer. ठीक है, and of course calling a national strike. So civil disobedience meaning the willful violation of certain laws which are deemed to be illegitimate. Courting arrest मतलब जेल भरो आंदोलन, so that the British law and order system becomes overburdened. And fasting and prayer in order to convey that the people who are involved in this struggle are performing some kind of a religious duty. It is their sacred duty to provide a national service. Further, they are driven not by wanton violence but a genuine desire for reform. Okay, so they are fighting for their rights. They are on the side of righteousness. तो जो क्लासिकल गांधीयन फ्रेमवर्क था, द स्ट्रैटेजी ऑफ सत्याग्रह, वो यहाँ पे पहली बार हमको देखने के लिए ऑन अ मास स्केल मिलती है. ठीक है. What was the nature of the response? Gandhi had worked miracles in India since his arrival. He had launched 3 successful satyagrahas against the British, although on a local level, but extremely successfully. And this had transformed his image into that of a miracle worker. तो चमत्कारी बाबा की image बन गई थी. People had a lot of hope and enthusiasm, and they responded to his call in large numbers. Further, Gandhi had been correct in realizing that there's a lot of hidden anger, hidden discontent, and mass unrest. That latent energy needs to be transformed into kinetic energy. And giving the call for an all India strike and mobilizing support through the Sarvdham Pratna Sabhas proved to be very effective. The response to the call was electrifying. And on the 6th of April, almost the whole of India came to a standstill. Public conveniences and services stopped working. For example, even in Mumbai, the Bombay local stopped working, and factories were shut down. The Indian workers, they organized lockouts and strikes across industrial towns. Lot of hartals were going on. Demonstrations were organized on a mass scale. And ऐसा नहीं है that this activity remained confined to a particular corner of India. Almost the whole of India was affected by this activity. Cities across India witnessed massive demonstrations, strikes, and violations of curfew laws. ठीक है, सो ये हो गया दी राउलट सत्याग्रह. However, soon the situation turned tragic. हुआ क्या that in Punjab, public anger against the British soon reached fever pitch. And क्यों हुआ ऐसा? Because Punjab had been the region that had been worst affected by the war. The impact of price rises and shortages was felt most acutely in Punjab, and the degree of conscription had affected Punjab the most. Punjab had borne the brunt of wartime hardships and the public confidence had reached the breaking point. Further, we must also remember that the memory of revolutionary activity in Punjab was still quite fresh. Punjab and the Punjabi culture provided the main energy behind the Gadar movement and the Gadar confederacy. Further, Punjab represented the core region of the Indian revolutionary sentiment. ठीक है, तो यहां पे आप लिख सकते हो गदर connection. I hope you'll be able to remember this association. And as a result, the movement in Punjab, the Rowlatt Satyagraha in Punjab, often turned violent against British public officials and British public infrastructure. तो जैसा होता है कि पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इज अटैक, गवर्नमेंट बिल्डिंग्स को आग लगा दी जाएगी, बसेस को आग लगा दी जाएगी, सेम काइंड्स ऑफ थिंग्स स्टार्टेड टू हैपन ओवर हियर. सम clashes between the police and the public are going to take place. Some instances of violence occurred in cities such as Lahore, Amritsar, and Sialkot. And British ने क्या किया? On April the 12th, on the 12th of April 1919, the British imposed martial law. ठीक है, बट प्रॉब्लम क्या था कि मार्शल लॉ का ऑर्डर तो पास हो गया, बट इट वाज नॉट publicized widely. ठीक है. However, the development did not get much publicity. क्यों? लोगों का अटेंशन किधर था? अंडर दी प्रोविजंस ऑफ मार्शल लॉ, जो यहां पर लोकल लीडर्स थे, they had been arrested by the British on the 12th of April. The local leaders of the Rowlatt Satyagraha that is Dr. Saifuddin Kichlew and S.P. Malik were arrested. ठीक है? And this formed the background of the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. So second लिखो. Jallianwala Bagh Massacre and the Hunter Inquiry Commission. On Baisakhi Day, 1919, that is the 13th of April, the people of Amritsar gathered publicly across Punjab for celebrations. Sorry, the people of Punjab gathered publicly for celebrations. One such gathering took place at the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. The religious congregants were also joined by political activists protesting the arrest of their leaders. कौन कौन? सैफुद्दीन किचलू एंड S.C. Malik, है ना? Now Dr. Kichlew and Dr. Malik. Now इसमें होता क्या है? Now the Jallianwala Bagh ना, if you have never visited, इट इज अ वॉल्ड गार्डन। तो एक साइड पे एक नैरो सा एंट्रेंस है एंड ऑन द अदर थ्री साइड्स इट इज कंप्लीटली वॉल्ड ऑफ। इट इज नॉट अ वेरी लार्ज स्पेस। हाउएवर अगर बहुत ज्यादा लोग हों वहां पर तो रफली 8 to 10,000 लोग वहां पे फिर भी आ सकते हैं। ठीक है। सो मिड साइज्ड ग्राउंड है एंड इट इज सराउंडेड बाई वॉल्स ऑन थ्री साइड्स विद अ नैरो ओपनिंग ऑन दी लास्ट साइड ऑन वन साइड। ऐसे में होता क्या है दैट ब्रिगेडियर जनरल ड्वायर ब्रिगेडियर जनरल डायर arrives with his troops and blocks off the only exit, and without giving any warning he orders his soldiers to begin firing upon the congregants, making no distinction between the religious congregants who were there to celebrate Baisakhi and the political prisoners, political protesters, activists, right? तो अंधाधुंध गोलियां चलना शुरू होती हैं and while the official report suggests that 379 people were killed, the unofficial numbers range between 6 to 8,000. Between 6 and 8,000 people are supposed to have died here on that day. ब्रिगेडियर डायर ये वही है जिसको आपने जनरल डायर सुना होगा, राइट? ब्रिगेडियर डायर blocked off the only exit and ordered his troops to open fire. Thousands died, with the official figure standing at 379. Now, this shook the conscience of the nation. जो बड़े नेता थे, they did not expect this turn of events at all. The national conscience was violently shaken at this barbarity. Rabindranath Tagore renounced his knighthood in disgust. He did not want to be associated with a regime which could carry out this kind of massacre. While Mahatma Gandhi returned his Kaisar-e-Hind medal, which he had received for his medical mission that he had organized during the Boer War, right, in South Africa. तो इन लोगों ने अपने अवार्ड्स, टाइटल्स, मेडल्स वगैरह रिनाउंस करना शुरू कर दिया और अवार्ड वापसी का सिलसिला यहाँ से शुरू हो जाता है। ठीक है। फर्दर महात्मा गांधी on the 19th of April 1919 withdrew the Rowlatt Satyagraha. बट मीकली विड्रॉ नहीं किया इन्होंने. He gave a justification for this. क्या बोला उन्होंने? That it is his mistake, he has committed a Himalayan blunder. क्या? That he has given the extremely powerful tool of non-violent satyagraha to a people who are not properly trained in it, in that method of non-violent satyagraha. So he admitted that the people of Punjab to a certain degree had also erred that, and he admitted his mistake that he had not been able to gauge the truly radical and revolutionary mood of the people of Punjab. तो उन्होंने ये बोलते हुए राउलेट सत्याग्रह को विड्रॉ तो कर लिया, but at the same time he gave indication of a major movement in the near future. He said that any expectation of further cooperation with this satanic regime is no longer possible, is futile. ठीक है? तो he said that he had made a Himalayan blunder while giving the powerful tool of non-violent satyagraha to a people who were not sufficiently trained in it. At the same time, he indicated a major mass movement in the near future by saying that any further cooperation with the satanic regime was no longer possible. ठीक है? तो ये तो हो जाता है जलियांवाला बाग मैसेकर. नाउ लुकिंग एट द आफ्टरमाथ, हुआ क्या? द ब्रिटिश instituted the Disorders Inquiry Commission, also known as the Hunter Inquiry Commission. पूरा नहीं लिख रहा हूं, केवल हंटर कमीशन यहां पे लिख दे रहा हूं. द डिसऑर्डर्स इंक्वायरी कमीशन और द हंटर कमीशन with 7 members, out of which 3 were Indians, to do what? To investigate the activities of the 13th of April, Baisakhi Day, at the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. To investigate the जलियांवाला बाग मैसेकर, लेकिन उसको मैसेकर नहीं बोला गया था. इट हैड बीन रेफर्ड टू एज द इवेंट्स ऑफ बैसाखी डे एट अमृतसर. सो नो मेंशन ऑफ जलियांवाला बाग एंड नो मेंशन ऑफ अ मैसेकर. केवल उसको एक इंसिडेंट की तरह बोल दिया गया था. यू नो फ्रॉम द वेरी बिगनिंग की फाइंडिंग्स क्या होंगी. नाउ बिकॉज देयर वर 3 Indians, this commission had the veneer of being a fair commission. But you must realize that these 3 Indians were more British than the British themselves. In fact, one of the members was Satyendra Pratap. Sorry, क्या नाम था? I'm forgetting the name. He was the one who had served as the first member of the Secretary of State's India Council. ठीक है? Sorry, Governor General's Executive Council. SP, I'm forgetting the name, but you can see कि all 3 of them were more British than the British. जो मकौले का ब्राउन साहब वाला आर्केटाइप था ना, ये उस पे बिल्कुल फिट बैठते थे ये लोग. So while it had the veneer of fairness, the findings were never going to be fair. हुआ क्या? While Brigadier Dyer was found responsible for the loss of life and was stripped of command and it was recommended that he be recalled to Britain. तो इसका कमांड ले लिया, मतलब नौकरी चली गई, एंड ब्रिटेन वापस बुलाने के लिए रेकमेंड कर दिया इस कमीशन ने. However, no criminal charges were drafted. So he was determined to have been acting within the scope of his authority given that martial law was in effect. So कोई चार्ज ना मैनस्लॉटर का, ना कल्पेबल होमिसाइड का, मर्डर तो दूर की बात है, राइट? मास मर्डर तो और दूर की बात है. तो दिस बुचर ऑफ अमृतसर, he was let go simply with a slap on the wrist, right? In Britain, what was the response of the British public? They were celebrating the brave act of Brigadier Dyer. In Britain, Dyer was received as a hero. In fact, the British House of Lords, the upper chamber of the British Parliament, congratulated and praised Dyer for his so-called brave acts on the Baisakhi Day at Amritsar in 1919. रडियार्ड किपलिंग का नाम आप लोगों ने सुना होगा, जंगल बुक वाले. He was also the publisher of a very famous newspaper, very powerful newspaper called the Morning Post, right? And he was an imperialist of the first degree. तो इन्होंने किया क्या कि एक पब्लिक फंडिंग, क्राउड फंडिंग कैंपेन चलाया कि भाई he had been stripped of his command, पेंशन भी आधी मिलेगी अब क्योंकि डिसऑनरेबली डिस्चार्ज किया गया है. तो he wanted to create a comfortable nest, house nest for General Dyer so that he can spend his retirement in comfort. And the British public responded quite enthusiastically, and the Morning Post was able to raise a sum of more than 30,000 pounds for Dyer even before he set foot on English soil after being recalled in dishonor from India. Okay, so in Britain, Dyer was received as a hero, and you can imagine the kind of impact that it must have had on the Indian public mood, right? That not only had they been witness to savagery of the highest level from a regime that was claiming to be the champion of democracy, the champion of freedom, but the British public had also bared its extremely ugly and racist face, that the loss of Indian lives meant absolutely next to nothing for them. In fact, in the British public consciousness, Indians had been so dehumanized that their killing on a mass scale was something to be celebrated. Okay? So this filled the Indians with anger and the desire to act. Now what was needed was the right moment to do so. And वो आएगा कब? थर्ड लिखो, the Montford Reforms, also known as the Montague Chelmsford Reforms, also known as the Government of India Act 1919. Right. So Montford Reforms, or the Montague Chelmsford Reforms, named after the Secretary of State for India and the Governor General and Viceroy Chelmsford, or the Government of India Act 1919. तो पहले इसका बैकग्राउंड समझ लेते हैं. Now, the background of the Montford Reforms can be traced back to the August Declaration of 1917. I hope you guys remember this. The August Declaration of 1917 had promised constitutional reforms designed to introduce a responsible government in India. लेकिन उसका कोई टाइमलाइन नहीं फिक्स किया था. The exact parameters of this constitutional reforms, they had not been defined. It had not been clarified and deliberately left vague कि भाई responsible government का actual meaning क्या होगा, what would be the situation at the ground level, जो constitutional setup है उसमें क्या क्या arrangements होंगे, what is the scope of responsible government going to be, what are its limitations going to be, and when it comes to internal autonomy, तो जो Indian lawmakers हैं या फिर elected representatives हैं, what are going to be their rights vis-a-vis the unelected appointed British officials, what will be the nature of the involvement of the constitutional officers such as the governors or the governor generals in the day-to-day running of the governments, right? तो ये सब कुछ clarify नहीं किया गया था, बहुत vague सा statement था. I hope you guys remember that. And on the basis of the August Declaration, it was also known as the Montague Declaration, Montague and Chelmsford, the Secretary of State for India and Governor General and Viceroy of India, prepared a report known as the Montford Report in 1918. Its recommendations were codified in the Government of India Act 1919. And the second reason for the introduction of the Montford reforms was the intensification of nationalism since the end of the war. Not only since the end of the war, but during the war and since the end of the war. The Home Rule movement, the re-entry of extremists into Congress, success of the 3 early Gandhian Satyagrahas, and the fallout of the Rowlatt Satyagraha, along with the additional outrage caused by the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, had greatly intensified nationalism. Thus, the government was compelled to introduce the Montford reforms as a measure to pacify the nationalists. Okay? So, it was introduced in order to satisfy the nationalist sentiment. The government believed that these reforms are going to placate the nationalist mood and they'll be able to diffuse the growing mass unrest and public discontent, nationalist discontent, and this is going to allow the smoother running of the colonial government of India. However, these expectations were to be rudely broken. ठीक है, क्यों? Because problem was that the provisions of the act were nowhere in sync with the actual nature of nationalist demands. Nationalists were expecting real change, real reform, and ये अंग्रेज क्या कर रहे थे? They were only providing lip service. That without introducing reforms, they wanted to create the impression that wide-ranging reforms have been introduced. So this left the nationalists feeling betrayed, that their trust had been broken, and even more angry, even more restless. And this played into the already rising discontent that was sweeping across India since the end of the First World War. Provisions क्या क्या हैं? सबसे पहला, it introduced a bicameral legislature at the center. ठीक है, तो दो हाउसेज में अब जो सेंट्रल लेजिस्लेचर है उसको बाइफरकेट कर दिया गया. The lower house was known as the Central Legislative Assembly. The upper house was known as the Council of States. Now, the lower house had 145 members. The upper house had 60 members. The Central Legislative Council or the lower house had a term of 3 years. अभी लोकसभा का टर्म है 5 years का, उस समय होता था 3 years का. The upper house or Council of States, अभी राज्यसभा का कोई definitive term नहीं होता है, it is a continuing house. However, under the 1919 Act, the upper house had a term of 5 years. Out of the 145 members of the lower house, 104 were to be elected, with 41 to be nominated by the government. In the upper house, out of the 60 members, 36 were to be elected, but 24 were to be nominated. Now, if there is a question asking you to compare the provisions of the Indian Councils Act 1909 and the Government of India Act 1919, तो ये जितने parameters है ना, you should be able to keep these in mind. So it is not only going to require to adopt a conceptual understanding, but factual information भी थोड़ा थोड़ा होना चाहिए. And exact मैं ये नहीं बोल रहा हूँ कि numbers आप याद करके देखो. In case of the 1919 Act, Imperial Legislative Council में official majority थी, and जो provincial legislative councils थे वहां पे नॉन ऑफिशियल बट नॉन इलेक्टेड मेजोरिटी थी. यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है कि भाई इलेक्टेड मेजोरिटी दोनों में हो गई है, बट at the center there is elected majority, but there is a healthy section of nominated minority. तो ये ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन हो रहा है. तो incremental improvements were being given while Indians wanted radical reform. Secondly, this act provided for the state-wise allocation of seats in the central legislature, not on the basis of population, जो कि customary practice होता है, but on the basis of importance of that province for the British government. तो imperial interest के according अलग-अलग states को central legislature में weightage मिलेगा, seats मिलेंगी. For example, since Bombay was financially very important, it was given more seats than its population, proportion of its population. And since Punjab was important militarily, so it was given more seats. Okay? So state-wise allocation in the central legislature was done on the basis of importance. Further, this act also introduced legislative devolution for the first time in India. It provided for the creation of 2 legislative lists. अभी कितनी है? 3 है ना? Union list, state list and the residuary list. इस समय कितने थे? 2 थे. Central list and the provincial list. So only 2. Residuary powers now reside with the parliament, that is the central legislature. However, back then ऐसा नहीं है कि central legislature के पास residuary powers होते थे. They used to reside with the governor general. So governor general unilaterally could make laws on all those subjects which are neither covered in the central or the provincial list. ठीक है? So residuary powers with the governor general. This was another problem. This provided extraordinary legislative power to an unelected British official. Fourthly, जो कि इस पूरे एक्ट का सबसे ज्यादा कंट्रोवर्शियल प्रोविजन है, it also introduced executive diarchy at the provincial level. तो executive diarchy का मतलब क्या हो गया? देखो, at the level of the provinces ना, डायरकी का मतलब होता है द रूल ऑफ टू, राइट? नाउ provincial governments would have particular responsibilities, so they would be given the exclusive responsibility to oversee particular subjects of administration, such as law and order, regulation of agriculture, education, police, industry, irrigation, ये सब उसके पास पावर्स होती थी. अब डायरकी में किया क्या गया, दैट द सब्जेक्ट्स ऑफ लेजिस्लेशन, sorry, subjects of administration, provincial administration, that was bifurcated into two groups or two lists, और दो lists prepare किए गए. The reserved list and the transferred list. ठीक है? Now ideally जो भी स्टेट का एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन है, नॉमिनली all the executive action takes place through the office of the governor. So in the under the seal of the governor with his signature under his name and seal, जितना भी executive action है वो होता है. ठीक है? Now however, the governor is supposed to act on the aid and advice of the elected ministers of that state. लेकिन यहाँ पे arrangement कुछ और था. The subjects mentioned in the reserved list were to be overseen by the governors, aided not by elected ministers but by his executive council. ठीक है? So unelected British officials are going to convene with the governors, and without any consultation with the elected ministers, they are going to take important decisions with regards to administration. और यहां पर governors based on the aid and advice of elected ministers or the council of ministers, they were empowered to discharge the administrative functions mentioned in the transferred list. और reserved list में unelected executive councillors का रोल होगा. और यहाँ पे पावर्स का डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन थोड़ा अनसाइंटिफिक तरह से किया गया. फाइनेंस, पुलिस, इरिगेशन, पावर एटसेट्रा वो रिजर्व सब्जेक्ट्स की तरह कैटेगराइज कर दिए गए. वेयर एज एजुकेशन, हेल्थ, एग्रीकल्चर, इंडस्ट्री एटसेट्रा, they were categorized under the transferred subjects, transferred list में डाल दिए गए. तो यानी कि जो elected ministers हैं, they would have all the responsibilities of governing, but the actual power to govern resided with the unelected executive council. So this had provided for a division of administrative authority in such a manner that power and responsibility were divorced from each other. So पावर विदाउट रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी, व्हाट डज इट लीड टू? कि भाई आपके पास पावर सारी है बट यू डू नॉट हैव एनी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज, कोई अकाउंटेबिलिटी नहीं है, तो व्हाट आर यू गोइंग टू यूज? यू आर गोइंग टू मिसयूज योर पावर. इट रिजल्ट्स इन autocracy, arbitrary rule. And if you have all the responsibility of governing without any power to govern, this is going to result in impotence, ineffective governance. And the reason that this division had been done was also quite telling. Now, the British from the very beginning had been claiming that we cannot give Indians the right to govern themselves because they are unfit to rule. Okay? They don't have the training, the temperament, or the intellect to govern themselves, and therefore the interests of Indians are better served under unelected British officials and administrators. Now, Indians expectedly did not like this बहुत लंबी जंग छेड़ी, national movement activism. They had been demanding self-governance. Now, ultimately, the British had to come up with this arrangement, but the arrangement had been done in such a manner that it was always going to result in failure. And governance का failure होता, तो what could the British have claimed? See, there is an Indian minister who is in charge of education, Indian minister who is in charge of health, Indian minister who is in charge of industry, Indian minister who is in charge of agriculture. There's an Indian chief minister or premier at each of the provinces. They are the ones who are actually holding the reins of power, and administrative mismanagement का blame जो है, that could have been transferred onto Indians, thus proving that Indians were actually unfit to rule. ठीक है? तो by very clever design they had made this bifurcation, diarchy को introduce किया था. It was always meant to fail. I hope you got this. तो ये हो गया diarchy. So it also introduced executive diarchy at the provincial level. Subjects of provincial administration were further divided into reserved and transferred lists. The reserved subjects were administered by the governor on the basis of the aid and advice of the executive council. तो यानी कि यहाँ पर कोई पॉपुलर अकाउंट पब्लिक को अकाउंटेबिलिटी नहीं था. The transferred subjects were administered by the governor on the aid and advice of the council of ministers. So when it came to the transferred subjects, यहाँ पे public accountability था, responsible government देखने के लिए मिलता था. तो introduction of diarchy actually meant the introduction of partial responsible government. At which level? Both at the central and provincial level, or only at the provincial level? Only at the provincial level. ठीक है? तो अंग्रेज 1917 से बोले जा रहे थे रिस्पॉन्सिबल गवर्नमेंट, सेल्फ गवर्नमेंट एटसेट्रा इंट्रोड्यूस करेंगे. एंड में मिला क्या? First of all, responsible government only at the provincial level, and secondly, only partially responsible government at the provincial level, and that too, which was designed to fail from the very beginning. ठीक है? So, at the provincial level, a partially responsible government was introduced, but the concept of responsible government was completely missing at the center. तो center पर कोई भी responsible government का नामो निशान नहीं मिल रहा था. वहां पर there was no division of subjects into reserved and transferred lists, and all administrative or executive power resided in the governor general, and he acted on the basis of the aid and advice, not of any elected council of ministers. So there was no concept of an elected government at the center. Rather, he acted on the basis of the aid and advice of his unelected executive councillors. Okay? The size of the executive council had been increased from 6 to 8 now, and अलग अलग हेड्स ऑफ एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन, फॉर एग्जाम्पल एक मिलिट्री मेंबर होगा, एक लॉ मेंबर होगा, एक फाइनेंस मेंबर होगा, एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा. On the basis of their aid and advice, he is going to take all his decisions. Now, the legislators, members of the legislative councils, they had been given certain additional powers. For example, they now had the power to ask questions and supplementaries. This was there in 1909 also. They were given the additional power to pass adjournment motions. And lastly, they were given the power to vote on parts of the budget. But problem क्या था यहाँ पर? They could not censure the government. Adjournment motions को pass कर सकते थे, but they could not censure the government. They could not topple the government, and they did not even have complete financial response or control of the government. So since they had the right to vote only on parts of the budget, not on the budget as a whole, so they could make very little impact on फाइनेंशियल मिसमैनेजमेंट एंड दी कंटिन्यूइंग ड्रेन ऑफ वेल्थ. ठीक है, तो यहां पर कुछ पावर्स तो एक्स्ट्रा दिए गए, बट दीज वर मीनिंगलेस. नेक्स्ट, while the principle of direct election was introduced, but यहां पर भी प्रॉब्लम क्या था? Universal adult franchise was not introduced. Rather, limited franchise continued. That means voting rights were not given to all Indians above the age of maturity, either 18 or 21. Rather, only Indians who are above the age of 21 and fulfill certain educational and property based criteria, they were given the right to vote. अब इनडायरेक्ट इलेक्शंस तो नहीं होंगे, डायरेक्ट इलेक्शंस होंगे, बट लिमिटेड फ्रैंचाइज पे के बेसिस पर. Women were also given the right to vote for the first time during this under this act, right? However, once again, participation of women at the ground level was very, very minuscule. Why? Because once again, they were subjected to the same property and educational criteria. And India mein problem kya tha? Women's access to education and right to inherit or own property had been quite limited in nature. So very few women were actually eligible to vote. Now, in the 1909 Act, it had been decided that one member in the Governor General's Executive Council would be Indian. अब इसको बढ़ा करके 3 कर दिया गया. So 3 out of 8 members of the Governor General's Executive Council were to be Indians from this point onwards. Okay. Further, for the first time, an Indian High Commissioner was appointed at London to represent the interests of the government of India in London. इसके पहले इंडिया का फॉरेन पॉलिसी ब्रिटिश ऑफिशियल से मैनेज. दिस इज आल्सो गोइंग टू बी अ ब्रिटिश ऑफिशियल, बट ही इज नॉट गोइंग टू बी अ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ द ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट. रादर ही बिकेम अ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया. सो इंडिपेंडेंट फॉरेन पॉलिसी का फर्स्ट स्टेप था ये. एंड इंडियन हाई कमिश्नर स्टेशन एट लंडन वुड रिप्रेजेंट द इंडियन गवर्नमेंट. इंडियंस had been demanding for a very long time, Dada Bhai Naroji के समय से, that the Secretary of State for India and members of his India Council, they must no longer continue to be paid by the Indian taxpayer. Rather, their salaries, expenses, pensions, etc., they must be taken out of the British Exchequer. So British Treasury should pay for them, because this was a major drain on the wealth of India. So this demand was ultimately fulfilled in 1919. The expenses and salaries of the Secretary of State for India and his Indian Council would now be borne by the British Exchequer, no longer by the Indian Treasury. So Indian government of India is no longer going to pay for the salary, expenses and pensions of the Secretary of State for India and his India Council. अब British Treasury से पैसा मिलेगा. Further, this act provided that elected governments in the provinces could be removed arbitrarily by the governors. So, without any no confidence motion, governor wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, mood खराब है, तो government को ही topple कर सकता है. ठीक है? He would not have to provide any legal reasoning or constitutional reasoning for that. So arbitrarily, he could end the government. He could suspend the legislature. So this was once again an extremely extraordinary power which made the governor the true conductor of legislative activity, financial control and executive authority at the state level. तो जो डायरकी था ना, उससे परे भी एक लेवल पे ब्रिटिश रिटेन्ड कंट्रोल ओवर द इलेक्टेड गवर्नमेंट्स. Further, in the provincial legislatures, the introduction of a bill needed the prior approval of the governor. So, to introduce a bill, you would first need prior approval from the governor. The governor, therefore, will never allow a bill deemed to be embarrassing or problematic for British interests in India. So, this further constricted the scope of nationalist politics within the provincial councils and within the elected governments at the provincial level. Further, the governor also had the right to veto bills and restore any cuts to the budget. So, कोई bill अगर introduce हुआ है and if the elected legislature votes against it, but it is in the interest of the government, votes for it, but it is against the interest of the government, the governor can then veto it. तो not only prior approval but veto का power भी इसको मिल गया. Further, if the members of the house at the provincial level vote against a particular provision of the budget, तो उसको governor अपने individual action के through restore कर सकता था. So he could restore any cuts to the budget. Similar type of powers were also given to the Governor General of India. Governor General of India had the power to certify bills, restore cuts and make ordinances for the whole of British India. Okay? So if any bill has been defeated, he could reanimate it by certifying the bill. If any cut to the budget has been made by the legislature, he could restore the cuts. And in case either the central or the provincial legislatures have been suspended or are not in session, he has the power to make ordinances not only for the whole of British India but for any part thereof. तो any particular province or group of provinces उनके लिए अलग से ये ordinances pass कर सकता था. ठीक है. Further, the hated institution of separate electorates was further extended. In 1909, it had been granted to Indian Muslims and zamindars, right? अब किसको मिलेगा? Sikhs, Anglo-Indians and Indian Christians को. ठीक है. So these were the provisions of the bill. Now, why did it fail to satisfy the Indian nationalist sentiment? Critical evaluation. We have already seen many problems with the bill. अब उसको एक more cohesive narrative में देख लेते हैं. This act failed to fulfill nationalist aspirations who had been eagerly awaiting liberal reforms in line with the spirit of the August Declaration. So the Indians expected the British to pursue the spirit of the August Declaration. What was the spirit of the August Declaration? That the British, whatever next set of constitutional reforms they introduce, they are going to actively pursue the final objective of granting complete self-government to Indians. However, the Montford Reforms failed to do this. It became controversial, especially due to the introduction of diarchy in the provinces. The division of the subjects between the reserved lists and transferred lists was unscientific and irrational. All the subjects of greater importance were kept in the reserved list, while the transferred list has subjects of lesser importance. तो power एक side पे है, responsibility एक side पे है, resulting in arbitrary rule and autocracy and impotence and ineffective governance on the other. Elected ministers would have to constantly seek the approval of British officials. It led to constant friction and poor governance. Okay? So it was always meant to fail. Further, the act had a number of other shortcomings as well. For example, the lack of universal adult franchise. Out of a total population of about 26 crore people, only 15 lakh Indians were eligible to vote. Okay? So very minuscule proportion of the population, even though direct elections ho rahe the, they could actually participate in voting. Secondly, the system of separate electorates along communal lines had been expanded, thus further threatening the unity of India. Communalism was being institutionalized at a much deeper level through the extension of separate electorates. Indians का डिमांड कर रहे थे कि इसको abolish कर देना चाहिए. Thirdly, the Governor General and governors continued to enjoy overarching powers, which made responsible government a quickly vanishing friction. Now, any scenario in which unelected presiding officers can bypass or overrule the popular mandate is a recipe for constitutional autocracy. So while the Montford reforms were trying to create a veneer of responsible government, जो उनका substance था ना, that was to make the British government of India more autocratic. In fact, उसको एक constitutional legitimacy मिल जाए उनके autocracy को. So it was an exercise in constitutional autocracy. Although the number of elected members in the chamber had been increased, the presence of a large number of nominated members went against the principle of popular sovereignty. So out of 145, 41 were nominated in the Central Legislative Assembly, and out of 60, 24 were nominated in the Council of States. तो बहुत मेजर proportion हो गया unelected officials का, and this is against the conventions of popular sovereignty. ठीक है. Further, you can add some other things कि भाई there was no real financial control over the government. Legislatures did not have any real financial control over the government. Accountability नहीं था, governors could topple the elected governments, etc. etc. तो ये सारे इसके problems हो गए थे. Thus, the Government of India Act 1919 was designed to give the appearance of introducing responsible self-government while expanding the scope of constitutional autocracy. It became one of the reasons for the surge in mass politics during the early 1920s. ठीक है, तो ये हो गया the third major issue contributing to the rise of popular discontent, and fourth one is the खिलाफत issue. वो हम next class में discuss करेंगे along with the खिलाफत non cooperation movement. Till then एक question ले लीजिए. Throw light on the factors responsible for the rise of post-war discontent against British colonial rule in India during 1919. 15 marks. So here we have to talk about all the factors beginning from the Rowlatt Satyagraha to the खिलाफत issue. खिलाफत issue अभी कवर नहीं हुआ है, नेक्स्ट क्लास में कवर हो जाएगा, तो उसको भी इनकॉर्पोरेट कर लीजिएगा. स्ट्रक्चर बनाने की जरूर लेकिन कोशिश करिए अगर पूरा आंसर नहीं लिख रहे हैं तो. नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, the introduction of diarchy at the or in the provinces became or galvanized The mass political activity under Gandhi. Explain. 10 marks, 150 words. While this question more specifically deals with the Montford reforms and that too with the provision of diarchy, but over here हमको दिखाना क्या है? That diarchy was the final nail in the coffin. Discontent had been building against the British rule ever since April 1919 or March 1919 with the Rowlatt Satyagraha. उसके बाद blow after blow pushed the national mood further and further towards political activism, and Mahatma Gandhi was there to capitalize upon this opportunity. So we have to link diarchy with the खिलाफत नॉन कोऑपरेशन मूवमेंट, लेकिन उसके बैकग्राउंड्स को भी दिखाना होगा, बैकग्राउंड को भी दिखाना होगा. दैट इज व्हाट वी नीड टू डू ओवर हियर. ठीक है, तो ट्राई दीज क्वेश्चंस, लेट अस सी हाउ यू डू. थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम and I'll see you in our next lecture.